All right, good evening. My name is Susie Plott and I am the Community Development and Marketing Manager at Old Mission Santa Barbara. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to cover. A reminder that all attendees are on mute and video screens are turned off. This session is being recorded and will be posted on our website for the community. If you have any questions during the presentation, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I will be keeping an eye on them during the presentation, and then we will also have time at the end for a Q&A. I would now like to introduce Monica Orozco, Executive Director of Old Mission Santa Barbara.
Thank you, Susie. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of everyone at Old Mission Santa Barbara and the Santa Barbara Mission Archive Library, and to acknowledge that I am on the traditional land of the Barbareño Chumash people. As Franciscan organizations, it's important for us to actively participate in the work for racial and social justice and to acknowledge our past as we try to build a more just world. Tonight's program and this series are part of our efforts towards these goals. This series is being offered free of charge. However, if you'd like to support this and other programs featuring speakers and topics such as these, you can do so by making a donation to the mission through a link that will be included in a follow-up email or by visiting our website. This is completely optional. We appreciate your support just by joining us this evening. Our speaker tonight is Dr. John Johnson. Dr. Johnson has served as curator of anthropology at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History for 35 years. He received his PhD in anthropology at UC Santa Barbara in 1988. For 17 years, he has taught an annual course on California Indians at UCSB, where he holds an appointment as adjunct professor of anthropology. Dr. Johnson has served on the board of directors for the Santa Barbara Mission Archive Library since 1993. His written contributions include more than 100 studies regarding the cultures, history, and prehistory of California's native peoples, especially emphasizing the Chumash Indians of the Santa Barbara region. Please welcome John Johnson. Hi, John.
There I am. Okay, now I'm unmuted. Okay. Hi, Monica, Susie, and everyone. Well, I guess I'll go ahead and share my screen, and then we can get started with the program. Okay, is it anything being shown? No.
We can see your, there we go. Yep.
There we go. Okay.
So if you'll just press, yep. Perfect. Oh.
See, you're.
Yep. Now just swap it. Perfect.
There we go. Also, so the title of my talk tonight is Chumash Transformations, and I'm going to talk about cultural change and continuity during the mission period. And this photograph shown here, which I'll also be showing in the show, is of a Chumash couple, Justo and his wife Cecilia, who were both Barbareño Chumash Indians, born and raised in Santa Barbara at the mission. And here they are shown in 1873 with the mission behind them. And they're standing at the location of where the Indian Rancheria once was located that was affiliated with Mission Santa Barbara. Okay, well, in this talk, what I'm going to do is first discuss what Chumash life was like before colonization, and then try to answer the question, how did Chumash people cope and adapt to the changes that resulted from the founding of the missions and presidio in their territory? What was Chumash life like after the mission period came to a close? And how do the archival records, such as those in the Santa Barbara Mission Archive Library, assist in developing a more nuanced history of cultural change and continuity during the Nishan times and afterwards? And then how can these records be useful today to help Chumash Indians in preserving their heritage and identity in the modern world? So I'm going to touch upon all these topics, and starting with what was Chumash life like before colonization. So here is a map that shows the Chumash ethno-linguistic groups as we recognize them. Linguists actually identify 6 different Chumash languages. These are separate languages. So Chumash, properly speaking, is a name of a language family. And in fact, a language family that has no linguistic relatives anywhere else in the Americas. It's an isolate language family located just here in South Central California, and probably has ancient roots in this territory. And so because we are in Barbareño Chumash homeland right now, I'm going to emphasize the Barbareño Chumash in my talk as we proceed. We know a little bit about how Chumash population was distributed across the landscape. I'm going to touch upon this a little later too, but here's a map that just gives you a visual representation of where the largest Chumash towns were located. And they were along the mainland coast here between about down in Ventura County, Point Mugu, all the way up to the Goleta Valley and Dos Pueblos. Those were the largest towns were located along the mainland coast. And of course, these people, a big part of their economy was maritime subsistence, was fishing and living off marine resources. And that allowed them to establish a permanent, long-lasting Chumash towns along the coast. So here's a map, the earliest map that we have showing the area around Goleta. And this was made in 1782 at the time that the supply ship that provisioned the Santa Barbara Presidio, this is when the Santa Barbara Presidio was established, and they did some mapping along our coast. This is one of the maps that they made. And you can see there's a very dense concentration of people living around the Goleta estuary there. Wherever you see those letter A is where there were Chumash neighborhoods, Barbareño Chumash people living in those areas. And this is a image here showing an artist representation, Russell Ruiz, showing what it must have looked like when the Spanish first came into this area, and this is how Chumash Indians were living. Around the Goleta estuary there in Goleta Valley. Now, the Chumash Indians are noted for several achievements in material culture. And one of these, of course, is the Tomal or plank canoe. The Chumash and their neighbors to the south are the only people along the whole Pacific coast of North America that used plank boats, that made these Chumash boats out of planks split from driftwood logs and sewn together with cordage made out of dogbane that grows in the mountains here, and then sealed. The boards were sealed, the planks, with a tar mixed with pine pitch, and they were sewn together. And the places where they drilled the holes were also sealed with tar mixed with pine pitch. And these were very seaworthy, and every explorer who ever encountered the Chumash remarked upon how amazed they were by these plank boats. The Chumash are also known for their bead money. The olivella beads that were very prevalent, or olivella shells that were very prevalent around the Channel Islands, provided the raw material, which the Indians of the Channel Islands then fashioned into beads. They would chip out discs and then drill them, and they would, there was a whole industry centered on our Channel Islands. The Channel Islands were the mint for the Chumash regions in making shell bead money. In fact, the name Chumash originally referred to just the people of the Channel Islands, and the name comes from the word alchum, which means bead money in Chumash. So the Chumash are bead money makers. And Chumash bead money has been found traded to people beyond the Santa Barbara region into the Central Valley, all the way up into the Sacramento Valley, the San Francisco Bay Area, and then traded into the Great Basin and into the American Southwest, all the way to the Rio Grande River. We find Chumash bead money being traded. The Chumash traders didn't actually visit those areas. They would trade to the people next door, and they would trade to their neighbors and so on. So eventually Chumash bead money got spread all over the place, but all manufactured on our Channel Islands. Chumash are also known for their high quality of their basketry and stonework. And here's some examples of Chumash basketry in the lower left corner. And Chumash are also famous, world famous, for the rock paintings that exist especially in our backcountry, in different rock shelters. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of these achievements as we go on, starting with the plank canoe. The plank canoe, of course, was important not only for transportation, but also for fishing. And each of these boats is feeding, I've estimated, about 40 people in each Chumash town. And so the catch of this fish is very important for subsistence of those people in those large coastal towns. And this is an artist's sketch of an incident that was witnessed in 1776 and described in the diary of Father Pedro Font, who traveled with Anza. And he mentions that when he came to Santa Barbara, that there were Indians out fishing in their plank boat. They came ashore with the fish, and then they hoisted the plank canoe on their shoulders and carried it to the chief, who was shown there, the owner of the boat, who was shown there wearing a bearskin cape, distinguished him from other people. So the owners of these boats were really important men in Chumash society. They were the catch from the boats that they financed, and it was very expensive and labor intensive to build a plank canoe. So they would organize people, build these boats, and they were very important high status individuals in Chumash society. The chiefs themselves were boat owners. They also were involved in trade. The chiefs owned these boats, and then the boats would go out to the Channel Islands, or people from the Channel Islands would take their boats over to the mainland, and they would trade for things they didn't have on the islands. And in exchange, they would trade bead money made on the islands to the people on the mainland. And so these are some of the items that they trade: the shell bead currency, as well as the people on the mainland would trade the people on the island wooden bowls, basketry, and seeds that they would harvest from wild plant resources, and which were not as plentiful on the islands. Now, I mentioned the Chumash rock paintings. This is just one example, Painted Cave, up on San Marcos Pass, very famous Chumash site. And this brings up the topic of religion. What kind of religion did Chumash Indians practice? And we know a little bit about Chumash religion because of the ethnographic interviews that were conducted in the early 20th century by John Peabody Harrington, who interviewed Chumash elders and recorded what they knew about old traditional ways. And one of the things that he was informed about was a Chumash winter solstice ceremony. And this was apparently the most sacred ceremony throughout the year, where rituals were conducted at the time of the winter solstice, which they conceptualized as when the sun was reborn, because the days were getting shorter and shorter, but at the winter solstice, then afterwards the days got longer. And so the sun was being reborn at that time. And there was a particular kind of ritual staff that was used at the winter solstice. This is one that was not found in Chumash territory, but in a cave with other ceremonial items in Los Angeles County, actually, in a rock shelter. And this particular item was what is called a sun stick or sun staff that was used in these winter solstice ceremonies. The Chumash also had ritual specialists, the shamans, who were involved in various kinds of ceremonies and healing sick people and so on. And there was a special type of shaman that was called a whale dreamer. And so you say, why would the Chumash have a whale dreamer? Well, this shaman's duty was to use these little carvings, these carved whales, as a way supernaturally to summon the whales so that they would strand themselves or beach themselves on the coast. Because whenever one of these whales would come ashore, it would be feast time, and the whole village would turn out and would feed on the whales. So the shamans were charged with the responsibility of trying to lure the whales to strand themselves near a Chumash town so there'd be plenty to eat. And these little effigies were called in Chumash Sakwutoi Ipachat, which means the whale's shadow or shadow of the whale. Okay, so that's just a really quick overview of some of the features of Chumash society as we know from ethnography and some of the explorers' diaries and also archaeology. But things really began to change, of course, when the first missions were founded. And the first Spanish land expedition came up the coast in 1769, and the diaries from this expedition are fascinating reading of what they observed, the Spanish explorers and the missionaries that was with them, what they observed in each Chumash town. And they estimated the size of the population, how many houses there were, how many plank canoes were there, and other features of Chumash society. Really an interesting observations that were made at this time. So this is another one of those maps that was made in 1782. This time it's of the Santa Barbara watershed. And there you can see where the presidio of Santa Barbara was just beginning to be built. And on the coast, you'll see there's two Chumash towns, again, shown with the letter A. One is called Yuktu, or Syuktun was the Chumash name. You can also see the area where the bird refuge is today called Salinas up here. It was a salt flat, so they called it the Salinas. And then on the coast further to the down coast is the village of Shalawa, which was Montecito. So this is what things looked like 10 years after that, or 11 years after that map was made. There you can see the village or town of Syuktun there to the lower left on the coast. Then in the middle distance is the presidio of Santa Barbara. And in the far distance is Mission Santa Barbara. And this illustration was made when Vancouver visited Santa Barbara in 1793. An artist on his ship sketched what Santa Barbara looked like. It's the earliest image that we have of Santa Barbara. Now, one of the documents that's preserved in the Santa Barbara Mission Archive Library is a questionnaire made in 1800 about mission life and what was life like at the mission. There was a controversy going on about how the Indians were treated at the missions. There was a missionary from Mission San Miguel who was sent back to Mexico because of misbehavior. And so when he got back there, he complained and made a number of accusations against the mission system. And the viceroy sent up a list of questions that were then the Indians at the different missions responded to. And so it's a very fascinating document, and we have copies of it in the Mission Archive Library. And it's been translated. But one of the questions was about is the Christian doctrine taught to Indians in their own language? And we have a number of surviving examples in the mission archives and in other archives of the prayers and also catechism and the confessionarios or confessionaries that are written in the different Indian languages, and we have several of these in Barbareño Chumash. And this is an example of one that's preserved at the Smithsonian Institution. And it's the act of faith that's written out in Barbareño Chumash as written down by an Indian who learned it from his father-in-law named Sabino. So Sabino had committed this prayer to memory and recited it to his son-in-law, who then recorded it. It was given to the chief of the San Ynez Indians in the late 19th century, who then gave it to someone to send to the Smithsonian Institution, and that's where it is today. So yes, to answer to this question, is the Christian doctrine was being taught to the Indians in their own language. That the missionaries, through the assistance of interpreters, began to learn the Indian language. In fact, the presidio comandante in Santa Barbara, Goycochea, he complained that the missionary at San Buenaventura was preaching in the Ventureño Chumash language down in Ventura, and that the Indians weren't learning Spanish because of the priest himself had been learning their language. So yes, there was an effort made to preach and also to record their Catholic texts in the native languages. Another question in this manuscript is, how many hours are the Indians made to work? So this gets to what was life like when Indians went to the mission and were baptized? Well, they mentioned that the work would start 2 hours after sunrise, and the Indians would go out to the fields to tend to the crops or their other work activities, and then building the mission and so on. And then 11:15, they would take a break, and then they would later on in the afternoon, not till late afternoon, they would then begin to work again, and but never more than an hour and a half, according to the missionary Father Esteban Tapis, who wrote this document, who was stationed at Mission Santa Barbara. He also mentions that the adobe makers each would make 40 bricks a day, and usually they would be finished by noon, and then they would have the afternoon off for their own activities. He mentions also that those who were weaving would make 10 varas of cloth a day, and if they made extra, they would again get paid for making more than a minimum amount. Father Tapis also mentions that the Indians would work on a schedule of having 3 weeks on and 1 week off. So after working for 3 weeks, they would then go out and could return, if they would wish to visit their native villages where maybe their relatives were located, and visit there. And then after the end of that week, they would come back and resume their work schedule at the mission. And he said if they lived in more distant rancherias, they would be given longer time off to travel back and forth. So it wasn't after a person was baptized, it wasn't that they were anchored. I mean, they were anchored at the mission, but they also were free to return to their relatives, after a certain number of work weeks, and then they would return to the mission. Okay, so he also mentions in this document, Father Esteban Tapis, that the Indians would work, and after the fall harvest, after they'd harvested the wheat and other grains that the mission had planted, they then would just leave, sometimes for a month or two, to go out and gather their own native crops. So it wasn't a complete break from the traditional subsistence activities. The Indians, in the fall would also supplement their diet of what they would be the foods that they would raise at the mission with going out and harvesting their native wild crops. And this is mentioned that one of the crops was the islay, or the holly leaf cherry, and it was not so much the fruit, although that was eaten too, but it was the cherry pits that the Chumash Indians would cook. They had to be very careful about it. They would crack open the shell and get out the pits, but they had to boil them, and they had to be very careful because the cyanide that's contained in the pits, it would be poisonous. So they had a way of processing it to make it edible, and they made little, after they would mash the boiled pits together and make little cakes that they would eat. And then, of course, acorns were a big crop in the fall. So they say the Islay would ripen first, they would harvest that, and then the acorns after that. And during all this time, that even though they were people who were living at the mission, they would live for that month or two, gathering the Islay and the acorns. Now, another important document that can be used in understanding the Chumash culture, both before the missions were established and the changes that occurred with missionization, are the mission registers themselves, the books of baptism, marriages, and burials. And some of the kinds of things you can study Chumash ethnogeography, you can look at the population density throughout the region, you can look at inter-village relationships and social networks, you can look at marriage and family patterns, you can look at the whole process of how people came over time into the missions. Looking at the baptismal patterns, you can examine birth and death rates of the population living at the missions. You can also collect genealogical information and use them as a supplement to other historical texts to identify people who are mentioned in various documents or in contemporary accounts. And so all of these purposes can be attained through studying these mission registers. And here's the late Father Virgilio Biasio, who was director of the Mission Archive Library a number of years ago, holding one of these mission books in the mission garden there, or behind the mission. And on the right is a page, an example of a page from the mission record. And I want to particularly point out the baptism record in the middle here, which is, I'll translate, it's in Spanish. It says, on the 12th day of the month of September in the year 1797 in the church of this mission of Santa Barbara, I baptized solemnly the following adults. First, a man about 60 years of age called Yanonali, a Capitan, or chief, of the rancheria of Siuktun, native of the same rancheria and father of Mateo Tatwid. I gave him the name Pedro. So this is a very typical entry from the mission records of someone who'd been baptized in, who'd been born in their native rancheria and came to the mission as an adult or as a child in some cases. And it would mention how old the person was, what their native village was. In his case, there's mentioning that he was a chief. It gives his Chumash name, and it tells how he's related to another Indian who'd been previously baptized, Mateo Tatwid. And it also here is where is recorded the Spanish name that he was given at the time of his baptism, Pedro. And of course, he was the chief of Santa Barbara at the time that the presidio was founded, originally in 1782. And he then, 15 years later, was when he was baptized. And on the left, you'll see there's a baptismal number that's given. And this number was sort of served as like, we use social security numbers as a way of identifying all of the individuals. So you'll see in the marriage record, they'll cross-reference back. This was Pedro number 1147 in the Book of Baptisms, or in the burial records. Oftentimes they cross-reference using the baptismal number as the identifier for each person, in addition to their Spanish and Chumash names. So all of this information is very useful and for studying Chumash history and aspects of their society. And so we've entered all of this information into a database. And this is a photo taken a number of years ago. You can tell by the antiquity of the computer there. But this is Gilbert Unzueta, who's a Chumash descendant, who was a research assistant and participant in this project, entering the data from the mission records into a computer database. And here's an example of what you can do with this data. This is actually part of the database that's sorted for all of the people who came from a particular Chumash village. This is a village up in the San Luis Obispo area, and most of these people were baptized at San Luis Obispo. But you can see there's their baptismal number in the left-hand column, their Spanish name, their native name, the village that they came from. And this Tsukyu is the way it would be pronounced in Northern Chumash, Tsukyu. The date they were baptized, their age, their sex. If we can identify the father and the mother, their baptismal identifiers are there. Cross-reference to their different marriage records. And some people were married, you know, their first spouse died and then they were married again, and maybe a third or even a fourth time. And then in the far columns, you have their burial record and their death year. So we've done this now for all of the missions in the Chumash region, where we've cross-referenced everybody, baptisms, marriages, burials, their names, their parents, and use this information to derive insight into what Chumash society was like. And so I mentioned that ethnogeography was one of the uses that these records help us to reconstruct. And so this is a map of the entire region where people spoke Chumash languages, and all of the native towns and villages where that we can identify based on mission record evidence that were contemporary with each other, and we have other clues as to where many of these places were located, so we can kind of reconstruct the whole settlement pattern throughout the Chumash region because of the existence of these records. And in this case, we've worked with linguists to record the names in their original as a linguist would spell them. We also can look at the population distribution. And I mentioned earlier that we know that the heaviest population were along the Santa Barbara Channel mainland, and that this is showing the density. And it turns out that we've done this actually. I worked with a late colleague, Randall Milliken, and we've reconstructed the population density for all of the areas of California, from the San Francisco Bay Area down to San Diego area. And in all of Aboriginal California, the highest population density was along the Santa Barbara Channel coast. And so this shows the productivity of the marine environment in our local area. And that's where the largest towns were located, as I mentioned, along the California coast. So this kind of information can be obtained from the mission records too. We also can look at how people were related to each other. And this is a chart that recently I published in an article about the Chumash history and social organization in the Goleta Valley. And there's a man, the triangles stand for our men, the circles women, and these are all the people who had been born in their native villages before they were baptized at Mission Santa Barbara. It's showing the chief, Mariano Mati Lewitt, who was, and how he's related to everybody else that you know, other families of people in the Goleta Valley. And not all are from the same village, and they're from different villages. So what we can do with this information is then use it to look at the whole social network of people from each village. So this is the village from which Matihuluit came from. It's the village of Saakpilil, or the town of Saakpilil, that was in Goleta, where Goleta is today. And these are all of the connections, the kinship connections, that we can document using the mission records, showing people from this village married to others throughout the Chumash region. And it gives you a whole snapshot of each, what the social interaction sphere looked like for each of these Chumash towns. And as you can see, there are people connected to the Channel Islands, married up the coast towards Point Conception, into the San Ynez Valley, back into the Cuyama Valley, and even all the way back into the watershed that drains into the Central Valley of California, and east beyond Ojai as well. So people living at this village were related to people in all of those other places. Finally, if we talk about Chumash social organization, we can also obtain insight into patterns that are obtainable no other way. And one would be when people marry, where would the couple go to live? Would they go live with their wife's relatives or go live with their husband's relatives? And because of the existence of the mission records, we can tell that most of the time, you know, up to 68% of the time, people would go, men and a husband and wife upon marriage would go live among his wife's relatives. The husband would live among his wife's relatives in her town or village. And this is true throughout the Santa Barbara, what is today Santa Barbara County, is when a couple would marry, most of the time, up to 70% of the time, the man would move and live with his wife's relatives. And so we could determine this for the Goleta Chumash too, as you can see in that third column over, where it says the percent of the people who are practicing matrilocal residence. We also can study the way that people came into the missions. And so this is a map that shows who was being baptized earlier. And you can see where the missions were established up at San Luis Obispo, much earlier, a decade earlier than the next mission in the Chumash territory. You can see that those people became part of the missions at a much earlier time than the people down here. And then San Buenaventura, established in 1782, and then Santa Barbara, 1786. And so the people closer to the mission are the ones that were tended to be, over time, migrate to the mission and become part of the mission population earlier than those living in more distant areas. We also can look at the chronology over time of how people entered the mission system. And so this is showing the three missions in what is today Santa Barbara County, Santa Barbara, La Purísima, and Santa Ynez. And we can see that here's the number of people baptized who had been born in their native rancherias from the time Mission Santa Barbara was established on the left in 1786 up until when the last of people who had still living apart from the missions came into the missions. And this chart is very informative. What it tells us is that for the first almost 20 years, there was a relatively, it was a fluctuating but relatively stable number of people who were entering the mission system. And it wasn't until 1803 that you get this kind of massive recruitment that goes on where people join the missions. And that was when Mission Santa Ynez was founded, 1784. And then the people from the interior area are, a lot of them affiliating with Mission Santa Ynez. And then most of these other people, the second peak over here, these are people who were living on the Channel Islands. And they were the last group to join the missions. So why did people come to the missions? That's what everyone wants to know. What was in it for them? And there's a number of factors, I think, at play here. One is that the mission was just getting going, in these earlier years. And but as the livestock associated with the missions increased in number, the herds of cattle, the herds of sheep, flocks of sheep, horses and goats and so on. They were consuming many of the native grasses or native plants that were formerly producing seeds that were harvested by Chumash Indians. So there's this kind of environmental transformation that's taking place because of livestock that are brought. The Chumash didn't really have livestock before Europeans arrived. But once we had these, the Spanish brought with them the cattle and sheep and goats and so on. And these herds and flocks began to multiply and grow. They then destroyed many of the native seed plants that Chumash Indians had used as one of their staples. And so by 1803, I think we'd reached kind of the tipping point because there was this environmental change that was going on because of the grazing animals. And it made the food supplies at the mission much more attractive to people. And so there are a number of factors besides that, but in 1803, we get this massive situation where people, one village at a time, everyone is being baptized at the missions. And along the coast, and the mainland coast, and in the interior. And then we have all of these people from the Channel Islands that didn't come to the mission until relatively late, 1816, 1817, or 15, 1816. And one of the things that's happening, we know from missionary correspondence, is that there was an extreme famine that was going on the Channel Islands. So why was this famine, why did it occur? Well, we know from other records that were kept down in Peru that there was an extreme El Nino event in that year, perhaps more severe than any El Nino that we've experienced since. And what happens during El Nino events? Well, it kills off the kelp because of the warm water around the Channel Islands, and that's where the Chumash Indians were doing most of their fishing. The other thing that was going on is the people whom the islanders had formerly traded with in times of where you might have an El Nino event, they could trade for food from the people on the mainland. All those people at the mainland were now affiliated with the missions. And so we have this kind of situation where there's scarcity in food because of the severe El Nino on the islands. And so we again get the people who are still on the islands migrating to the missions. And another thing we can do is to study the effects of introduced European diseases. Now, we all of us are all too aware right now of pandemics, our pandemic situation. And there were pandemics that occurred during mission times, and they were much more deadly because they still didn't know about germs. There were no such things as vaccines. And so we get these waves of epidemics that sweep through the mission system. And before the missions were established, there were infrequent, there were probably every now and then there'd be an epidemic, but people were more dispersed throughout the countryside and not as susceptible. Once people became concentrated in mission communities, these epidemics were much deadlier. And so you can see over time the increase in mortality that occurs at the missions, and each of those peaks is another epidemic. This one in 1801, we don't know exactly what it was. It was a respiratory illness with, it may have been diphtheria. In 1806 was the worst epidemic of the mission period, is measles. We get another measles epidemic here in 1821, and so on. And then after this period of time, we have other diseases coming in that are not recorded on this chart. We have cholera that came into California. We have smallpox and other things. So over time, it was a heavy decline a demographic collapse occurred in California Indian populations, including in the Chumash region. Another major event that occurred was the Chumash Uprising of 1824, where there was a soldier who whipped an Indian at Mission Santa Ynez for some transgression. The Indians rose up at Santa Ynez, fought with the soldiers of the guard. The word spread to La Purísima and also to Santa Barbara, and led to a conflict between the soldiers at the presidio marching up to the mission and fighting with the Indians at the mission, in Mission Canyon, actually. And during this, but the missionaries were the Indians told the missionaries, you're not our enemy. You know, they didn't like the soldiers, but they protected the missionaries during this uprising. And then they fled. The Indians of Mission Santa Barbara fled to the San Joaquin Valley. And there they stayed until June of the year. The uprising began, I think it was in February, and they stayed away until June, eventually returning to Mission Santa Barbara when the missionary went, and the president of the missions went out there to negotiate with them, and granted everyone amnesty, and they returned to the mission. So what did the mission look like? About the time of the missions were secularized in the 1830s. Here's a contemporary artist depiction of Mission Santa Barbara as published in Alfred Robinson's Life in California in the 1840s. And here is what Santa Barbara looked like. So what's going on here is, as the Indian population declined, and the non-Indian population was the descendants of the presidio soldiers and other settlers was growing. And by 1840, for the first time in the whole region, the whole Santa Barbara, Ventura region, the number of non-Indians exceeded the number of Indians still residing at the mission, the different missions, Santa Ynez, La Purísima, Santa Barbara, Ventura. And so there was, by this time too, Mexico had gained its independence earlier, and there was pressure put on the governor of California to take away the ownership of the lands from the missions. They were, the missionaries all along, the whole idea was they were to hold these lands in trust for the Indians, and then the Indians would then become citizens of Spain or of Mexico later on. And but as the Indian population dwindled, the pressure was on the governor of California, the Mexican governor of California, to distribute the lands. And so after the missions were secularized, then all of these ranchos were granted, the vast majority of them, to non-Indians. And in our region, the vast majority of them went to the Carrillo family and their relatives. Got all of this land in the Santa Barbara region. But there were still communities of Indians affiliated and just, with the different former missions. And this is a map that's showing where these mission Indian communities were located around each of the missions: Santa Barbara, Santa Ynez, La Purísima, and San Buenaventura. I'm going to particularly focus here on Santa Barbara. And you can see one of the places was Cieneguita, as they called it, La Cieneguita. Today we use the plural Cieneguitas, but in all of those early documents it's called La Cieneguita. And this is a map showing the Goleta Valley with all of the Chumash place names that have been identified in the Goleta Valley based on the ethnographic research of John Harrington. And where you see the purple triangles, that's where the Chumash towns were located around the Goleta Slough, the ones that are named in the Bishop records. And where you see the orange squares, those are the Chumash communities that existed after the missions were secularized. There was a village composed mainly of people from the Channel Islands there in Goleta, another one up on Maria Ignacia Creek at a ranch called in Chumash called Alicon, and then today it's called the Indian Orchard Ranch. And then right about where Modoc and Hollister come together, that was where La Cienegita was located. And La Cienegita was where the majority of the Indians, Barbareño Indians, were living. They built a chapel there, so the missionary from Santa Barbara, the Indians wouldn't have to go up to the old mission. The missionary would come down and visit and conduct services in the chapel at Cieneguitas. And then on the right, this is a map that's showing where Indian houses were located and the particular individual Chumash Indians were living right at the late 19th century. These are the people living there at the late 19th century, a map that was made by David Banks Rogers. We know the names of most of the Indians who were living at Cieneguitas, and this is an example from two lists of names, a partial list of names of people in the California State Census that were living at Cieneguitas and also up there on Maria Ignacia Creek. And they include Maria Ignacia and her husband, and you can see that he's his occupation is farmer, and then Maria Ignacia's two children and her mother as part of this family living on Maria Ignacia Creek. And then the people below her were living at La Cienegita, listed below her and onto the next page. And here we see another well-known Indian, Justo, and his wife Cecilia, with Justo's sister, and I think those may be a couple of either his children or relatives in his household. And he's making a living as a vaquero. And he was the chief of the Indians at La Cienegita. And he's also the one that was in that first photograph that I showed you, this one here. Here's Justo and Cecilia at the Mission Rancheria site in 1873. And here's another examples, or a number of photos we have. We have many photos of, or a number of photos of Indians who descended from those people who lived at La Cienegita and also at Mission Santa Barbara. And on the left is Francisco Solares. She was born at Cieneguita. She is the great-granddaughter of Pedro Yananali, the chief of Santa Barbara, who was baptized in 1796 and or 1797. And then we have Juan Justo on the right. His parents were Justo and Cecilia. This is a photograph taken by John Harrington. And I should mention that Francisca also, there are descendants of Francisca who are alive today. Pedro Yananali has descendants and living in California and Nevada. And then Juan Justo's cousin is shown in the lower right, Juana Castello. And so all these people have relatives that are today part of the Barbareño Chumash population. And here's Luisa Ignacio. And Luisa was the daughter-in-law of Maria Ignacia. She spoke the Barbareño Chumash language, lived up at the Indian Orchard Ranch, and eventually in the early 20th century, the family sold the ranch and she moved into town. And just recently, a few years ago, her home where she lived and where she worked with John Harrington, where this photograph was taken, which is right across the street from the Santa Barbara Historical Society, that home was designated a historical landmark in the city of Santa Barbara and is going to be preserved. And this is using the mission records, we can reconstruct the whole Ignacio family genealogy. And there's Maria Ignacia, for whom Maria Ignacia Creek is named there, who lived at the Indian Orchard. And then her the daughter-in-law, Luisa Ignacio, whose photograph I just showed. And then Also, Luisa's daughter Lucrecia, whose descendants live in Santa Barbara Goleta area today and elsewhere, and are part of the Barbareño tribe today. And so the mission records can help them trace back where their ancestors came from in the whole Santa Barbara region. And here's a photograph taken of Luisa's daughter, Lucrecia, in the middle there. And John Harrington is in this photograph. He's holding Angela Yee, and Mary Yee is the woman on the left, who's Lucrecia's daughter, holding her son, John Yee. And this photograph was taken at the Indian Orchard Ranch behind Goleta. And Mary Yee was raised by her grandmother, Luisa, and spoke Barbareño Chumash as her first language. She was the last person living who spoke a Chumash language as her first language. And here she is being interviewed on KTMS radio in Santa Barbara in, I think, the late 1947 or so, and interviewing her uncle, Tomas Ignacio, who also was a native speaker. And John Harrington worked with both of these individuals in documenting the Barbareño Chumash language. And Mary Yee's work continues today. This is her daughter, Ernestine DeSoto, who's going to be one of the panelists coming up, I think, next week in the speaker series. And here Ernestine is being recorded as part of the recording became part of an exhibit at the Huntington Library that was entitled The Legacy of the California Missions. And one of the things that they borrowed from the Mission Santa Barbara was a prayer board with the acts of faith, hope, and charity written in Barbareño Chumash back in the early 1800s. And Ernestine, because she heard the Chumash language spoken by her mother, the Barbareño Chumash language, she has very excellent pronunciation of Chumash words. And so she read the text from that prayer board as a recording, which then people could see the prayer board and listen to Ernestine saying the prayer in Barbareño Chumash at the exhibit at the Huntington Library. And today, there is a vital organization called the Barbareño Band of Chumash Indians. On the left is James Yee. There's Ernestine in the middle, and on the right is Barbara Lopez. All of them are members of that Barbareño organization. And James Yee currently is a graduate student studying linguistics at UCSB, and his dissertation is regarding his ancestral language. And for about 4 or 5 years now, he's been teaching a monthly or several times a month class to other Chumash Indians on how to speak the Barbareño language, using the text recorded by John Harrington, working with his grandmother, Mary Yee. So, in conclusion, what are the lessons we've learned from this very brief and overview of the Barbareño Chumash history? And well, one of the things we've learned is that the study of primary records in repositories like the Santa Barbara Mission Archive Library allow us to gain a more complete understanding of what Chumash society was like at the onset of the mission period. And these records provide us a more informed perspective regarding the experience of Chumash Indians during colonial times. I think if you're going to want to understand the mission period, you need to go back to these primary records. And the existence of mission registers provide evidence of the continuity of Chumash communities from the very beginning of the mission period all the way through to the post-mission times and down to the present day. The Chumash descendants can use these records to document their genealogies and trace their ancestors back to the original rancherias where they were born. And most importantly, these records aid in supporting contemporary Chumash people in their efforts to preserve and reconnect to their ancestral cultural heritage. Thank you.
All right, so if you want to stop sharing.
Oh. Okay.
Perfect. All right, so we do already have some few questions, so thank you so much. And I do want to, that was a perfect kind of ending and wrap up, so thank you for kind of introducing Ernestine, because it's a perfect segue into our session next week. And I do just want to make a quick comment that the recording that you mentioned of Ernestine is also in our museum. So if you're going through the Mission Museum, you can hear that there as well. But we do have quite a few questions already for you. So we'll get that started. So the first one says, what kind of evidence is there for the ways that the Barbareño Chumash have traditionally understood the passing of time? For example, how did the Barbareño Chumash mark the amount of time since a loved one passed away before the introduction of the Christian calendar?
Yeah, you know, of course, they mark the seasons based on they had a number of ways of measuring time throughout the year. And one would be where the sun would rise, you know, on the horizon. And of course, that changes and the days get longer and longer until the summer solstice, and then shorter and shorter till the winter solstice. So that kind of record keeping was what they would also note where on the horizon that sun would appear. But with regard to when someone passed away, you know, and how they would document, actually in Chumash culture, they wouldn't talk about deceased relatives. It was considered to be a taboo subject to mention after someone had died, to mention that person in polite conversation. And so you, until a certain amount of time passed, and then they would actually name, like a grandson would be named for his grandfather and things like that. But a certain amount of time would have to pass. So you really didn't want to, I think, maybe summon the spirit of the departed, you know, by mentioning their name too soon after they had gone. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, very interesting. So here's a question that says, once the Indians were baptized, did the missionaries provide food and shelter for them? And then a second part to that was, were they ever given any land?
Yes. Now, the first one was, were they given food and shelter? Or
correct, once they were baptized.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that, yes, they would become part of the mission population, and then all of the crops that were grown were really for the people, you know, at the mission, you know. But also they would give everybody who was a member of the mission population or had been baptized would be given an annual clothing allotment. And even though children would sometimes be baptized, their parents may, you know, they would go back and live with their parents in the native village, but they were still eligible for that clothing allotment. So that was kind of an inducement to get your children baptized, so you could get some of the that clothing allotment. What the second part of that question was?
Were they ever given any land?
Yes, and in post-mission times, Maria Ignacia, for example, she and her husband were given that parcel of land that was the Indian Orchard Ranch, that continued to be their ranch all the way down to the early 20th century, you know, and that was given to them during mission times. There's also, in the mission archives, there's another document that talks about a parcel of land in Cieneguitas that was passed along from, you know, a grandfather to his grandson, and then on, and that land was given to them because of they had been mission Indians. Now, in some of the missions, there's better documentation of the parcels of land than at other missions. In Santa Ynez, for example, we have a number of land grants that were given out to Indians at Santa Ynez, and those documents have survived. But in Santa Barbara, very few of the documents have survived. We think that took place. Ventura, we also have examples of land given to Indians. So Santa Ynez, Ventura, even in La Purísima, we have fewer of those documents that have survived at Santa Barbara.
Okay.
But they
thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Somebody here is saying that they would love to take the course that you teach. Can you provide any information on when and where that's held if they're interested?
Well, right now, it looks like I'll be teaching next winter at UCSB.
Okay.
And if someone's interested in auditing the class, they'd be welcome to take it, or if they want to take it for credit, they'd be welcome to do that as well.
Okay.
It looks like it'll be the winter quarter, 2022.
Okay, wonderful. So of course, somebody has entered a question with a word that I am not sure how to pronunciate. Giochia led an expedition to Bodega Bay. His Indian guide stopped near Tomales Bay and said he could go no further because there was another Indian territory. Was there this kind of territory in Chumash lands?
Yes, there was. They mentioned the Spanish missionaries mentioned that someone trespassing into someone else's territory without permission would be considered no, that they could be subject to attack if they entered someone else's territory. You have to understand that the land wasn't considered to be it belonged to the particular chief and his people who lived in that area, and they depended upon the resources, hunting and gathering and fishing, would be how they subsisted, how they lived. And so someone else coming into that territory might be hunting or gathering or fishing in your, where you got your food, so you didn't want that. So yeah, there was all over California, not just among the Chumash, but there were people protecting their territories and not going further without permission.
Yeah. Okay. Well, great. Well, thank you so much. There's a few comments in here just thanking you for just a wonderful presentation and fascinating cultural traditions and sharing that with us. And so I want to reciprocate that and also say thank you to you and for being here and for all the time and energy you put into your presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Yes, and thank you all of you for attending, and we look forward to having you with us next week as we continue on our journey. Great, thanks.